This video covers the general setup procedure for any of the common dual flush kits currently on the market. After you have selected and installed your particular kit, you'll want to adjust the half and full flush cycles for the maximum water savings possible without compromising toilet function. Fortunately, all dual flush kits are set up in essentially the same way, with the same basic adjustments, so the following procedure should apply to most any of them. The key to an efficient dual flush setup is getting the tank water level and flush cycles down to their lowest settings while still maintaining acceptable flush evacuations. In most cases, how much water used per cycle is largely personal choice, so the best approach is to start with the install manual recommendations for the kit and then tweak the settings as desired. Since there are many different toilet models and tank configurations, each requires a little trial and error to adjust properly. So let's get started. There are 4 adjustments to consider: the overall water level in the tank, the half flush and full flush slider settings on the dual flush valve itself, and the often overlooked but equally important adjustment of the bowl filler valve. Ideally, the half flush, or number 1 cycle if you will, should produce one minimal full siphon action, or chug as plumbers like to call it. Once the chug is complete, there should be little additional water behind it, because any additional water is simply wasted down the drain. Similarly, the full flush cycle should produce a larger chug or 2 smaller chugs depending on the toilet and water use desired. The full flush, or number 2 flush, will work very much the same as it did when the original flapper valve was in place, but as you will see, we can still reduce the water used in the full flush cycle as well. The first step is to set the water level in the tank by adjusting the tank filler valve. These valves are designed to shut off when the tank water level reaches the top of the float bowl, so we will simply lengthen or shorten the filler valve height until the top of the float bowl roughly aligns with the factory water line on the tank. This can be done either before or after installing the filler valve in the tank, but it's a little easier if done before. Then we'll go back and more finely adjust the water level using the float height thumb screw on the filler valve. Some filler valves, like the one shown here, have a fixed locking collar and are adjusted by simply twisting the inner base to unlock the detent. The fill valve length can then be extended or contracted as required and then twisted back to relock. Simply adjust the length such that the top of the float bowl is approximately even with the factory water line. Other filler valves have a sliding snap tab for a more positive lock into the detents. To adjust this valve type, release the snap tab by sliding it down, rotate to free the detent, and then extend or contract the length as required. Rotate back into the detents and slide the snap tab back up to relock. Note that with either valve type, you may have to extend or compress the inner base tube just slightly past the desired point to get it to slip back into one of the detent slots. Be careful not to use too much force when setting the valve length, or you risk breaking off the inner lock tab. It will snap smoothly and positively when everything is aligned properly. Now we're ready to set the flush cycles. We want to get the half flush set up properly first before worrying with the full flush, because it is the more finely tuned cycle. Once the half flush is set up, the full flush will actually be fairly easy to adjust because it will be set to use about the same amount of water previously used by the original flapper valve. The flush sliders on the flush valve work by raising or lowering the trip point of the internal floats that determine the water level where the piston valve drops and seals off flow to the bowl. The half flush slider is usually the larger of the two. Sliding it up raises the trip point and decreases the amount of water used, while sliding it down lowers the trip point and increases the amount of water used. We'll simply start by setting it to its midpoint and try a test flush. The goal of the half flush is to get one good chug with little extra water behind it as shown. This is plenty of water to fully evacuate the bowl for liquid waste and substantially lowers the water use in the toilet. Note the water level in the tank as the piston valve drops on the half flush to see how much less water is used. This is a standard 1.6 gallon per flush toilet, and as you can see, the half flush uses about 1/2 that amount. So this is the key setting for saving water. Another side benefit of the half flush cycle is that the tank fill time is also reduced by about 1/2. So that's 1/2 the water use, 1/2 the fill noise, and in this case about 30 seconds until the toilet is ready to flush again, versus over 1 minute for the full flush. In the time it is taken for this portion of the audio, the tank is already refilled, as you can see. Once the half flush cycle is working properly, setting the full flush is fairly easy because it simply adds more water for a larger chug or multiple chugs depending on the toilet. While the goal of the full flush is to approximate the regular flush produced by the original flapper valve, many toilets use excessive water for the regular flush cycle, and it can be reduced as well. With the half flush, we started with the slider at the middle position, but with the full flush, since we know it will simply add more water, we'll start with the slider all the way up for the lowest water setting and then increase from there until we get the flush volume where we want it. The last setting is the bowl filler valve, and while it may not seem to contribute much to the overall water usage, it can unnecessarily dump up to an additional 1/2 gallon into the bowl that simply drains away. The idea of the bowl filler valve is to top off the bowl for the next flush cycle, but in most toilets, the backflow from the previous flush partially or completely fills the bowl already, so little or no extra water is required. Notice during this bowl refill cycle how the bowl water reaches a certain level but then no longer rises, even as the bowl filler continues to add water. The rest of the water supplied by the bowl filler is just going down the drain. On this particular toilet, some additional bowl fill is required, so we'll set the bowl filler valve to trickle in just enough water to top off the bowl during the half flush cycle. As with the flush valve, we want to set up the bowl valve to work properly on the half flush, because we know the full flush will simply add more water. That concludes the basic setup for a standard dual flush kit. But before we close, there are a couple of other points to consider. First, recall that we set the overall tank water level approximately to the factory line. That was to ensure we had enough water height in the tank to properly set up the dual flush valve. However, depending on the tank height and width of your particular toilet, you may find that you can drop the water level down a good inch or more and still get acceptable flushes. Just be sure that the tank water level is not set much below the top of the flush valve itself, or else the floats inside won't lift properly. Now that you've taken the time to install and set up a dual flush kit, you'll want to get as much life out of it as possible. So that brings us to our final point. Do not use any type of cakes or cleaners inside the tank itself. Despite any assurances you may read on the packaging about these products being safe for toilet tank components, they are not safe for the more sophisticated dual flush designs and will greatly reduce their life. If you do want to install an internal cleaning system, go with one that pours the chemical directly into the bowl, such as the Fluidmaster Flush and Sparkle or Kaboom Scrub Free. We neither sell nor represent these products, but find they work well in combination with dual flush kits.